that last panel, and I'd like to extend a special thanks to Jenny Cole, who has been at RUSI for over 10 years and has just left us, but she really did an amazing amount to build up our resiliency program at RUSI. It's now my pleasure to chair today's keynote presentation and to introduce Christine Wormuth. She's the director of the Adrienne Arsht Center for Resilience at the Atlantic Council. The center was established this year, and so Christine is the first director of the center. The focus, and she'll talk more about it, is really to promote resilience, resilience for states, for cities, for communities, for individuals, and to help them respond and adapt to global threats. I think you'll agree with me that Christine is the right first director of the center after you hear from her. She has a really great mix of practical hands-on experience at the highest levels in the US government, as well as a significant research background. And so, in my view, these are mutually reinforcing. You go into government with having thought about a lot of these issues and try to really make some of the changes that you've been writing about, and then you take that expertise to the outside. She's demonstrated resilience already by surviving the transition from Obama to Trump, and so I think she should get credit for that as well. And
the best thing to do is to flee to London.
And of course, I think significantly, she's a senior associate fellow with us at RUSI. I just want to highlight, I know you have her bio, but I want to highlight a few points from her bio. Her most recent job in the US government was the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy at the Pentagon. That's the third highest job at the Pentagon. And Christine, I think, was the youngest USDP and the second woman, right?
Yes.
Which is great. So that's a good record. But before that, she was what is called, there's a lot of acronyms in the Pentagon, a DUSD, a Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. And she was responsible for strategy plans and forces, which meant she led the 2014 Quadrennial Defense Review. Before that, she worked for President Obama directly as the Director of Defense at the White House at the National Security Council. And prior to that, her first job in the Obama administration was the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Homeland Defense. So a real range of defense and homeland issues, really perfect for this job that she's at now. And of course, also prior to that, we worked together at CSIS, Center for Strategic and International Studies. So just a reminder quickly to everyone that we are following RUSI rules, which means that her presentation is on the record, but we'd like you to respect the Q&A to be off the record, and that way we can hopefully have a more frank and open discussion. Christine will speak for about 15 minutes or so we have plenty of time for conversation before then we go into lunch. So over to you, Christine.
Can I steal your pen?
Yeah.
So thanks very much, Karen. It's really a pleasure to be here. As Karen said, we've been colleagues for more than 10 years. And while I was pained to see her leave Washington, D.C., our loss was definitely RUSI's gains. And just in the last couple of days, it's been clear to me that she's doing a great job. And RUSI and the team are doing terrific work across a whole spectrum of issues, including resilience. It's also very nice for me to be back here in London. You all are sort of, I think, very much seen as the poster child for resilience in some ways. And actually, it's sort of a fun thing that the Adrienne Arsht Center did very recently. We had a screening of Dunkirk at the Smithsonian Museum with Chris Nolan, the director. And it was sort of a fun event to try to spotlight the idea of resilience and all of the amazing things that the British have done since World War II. We face different challenges, I think, today, whether it's continuing acts of terrorism, unfortunately, or whether it's the kind of political and economic challenges that have led to the Brexit decision. But clearly, I think there's just as much need for thinking about resilience now as there was, 75 years ago. And Karen, it's true that I certainly, as someone who spent most of my career in government, I do have a very healthy respect for scholarship and for true academic work. That said, I don't come from an academic background. I am someone who very much believes that the government sphere can benefit from academic research, but that's not kind of the background that I have. That said, I'm hoping at the Adrienne Arsht Center to be able to draw on the real high-quality work that's going on resilience in various parts of academia, and we very much want to promote the kind of interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary approaches that the previous panel was talking about. So my hope is that as we get started and start rolling up our sleeves and really digging into specific issues, that we will hopefully be able to form partnerships with many of the organizations that all of you represent. In the United States, the last couple of weeks worth of news have been filled with stories that, at least for Americans, tend to make people think about resilience. You know, we've seen amazing challenges that have been posed by Hurricane Harvey and Hurricane Irma, just posing enormous challenges for Texas, for Florida, and the other Gulf states. And now we're seeing, you know, a couple more hurricanes in the Gulf, Maria and Jose, that are sort of sweeping through the Caribbean just this week. I grew up actually in Texas, about 90 minutes north of Houston, and many of my school friends are living in Houston in the outer suburbs, and several of them have had homes that have been completely ruined. I mean, as I was looking up at the screen there, while Houston is quite a bit less green in many ways, the amount of water that Houston was exposed to in Hurricane Harvey looks very familiar to that. I actually had a couple of friends who put pictures on their Facebook pages showing their refrigerators floating in 4 feet of water, and the water in their first floors going up well beyond their fireplaces. And as damaging, I think, as Hurricanes Harvey and Irma have been for Texas and for the Florida Keys, it could have been worse. As I sat there watching it on TV, I was reflecting back to 2005 when New Orleans was hit by Hurricane Katrina. And I remember watching that and really feeling, frankly, ashamed as an American of the inability of our government, both at the federal level but also at the state and local level, to respond in any meaningful way. And at that time, I was actually at CSIS with Karen, and I was doing a big report looking at National Guard and Reserve issues, because at that time, you know, we were obviously sort of at the peak of the intervention in Iraq. There were a lot of issues around the National Guard and the strains that we were putting on the National Guard. But as many people know in the United States, our National Guard is usually called upon to respond to natural disasters. They certainly were in the last couple of weeks. So I got very interested in looking at sort of the problems with the responses to Hurricane Katrina, and actually in 2008 wrote a major report looking at preparedness levels in the United States and trying to assess how well had we learned the lessons learned coming out of Hurricane Katrina. And when I think back on that, you know, I feel very strongly, looking at where we are today, that the work we did in the emergency merit preparedness community, the work that was done to learn the lessons of Katrina, to learn the lessons from Hurricane Sandy more recently, particularly at the state and federal level, were a big part of the reason why the response to Harvey and Irma was actually as good as it was. And I'm not saying it was perfect, but certainly in comparison to Katrina especially, there were just leaps and bounds of improvement in terms of not only the immediate response, but actually there were steps that were taken, I think, in terms of thinking of infrastructure. There were steps that some of the hospitals in Houston took to try to well in advance prepare and protect the facilities from flooding that wouldn't have happened if we hadn't seen what we did in Katrina. I think the coordination, the communication, the cooperation between local, state, and federal governments is much better now, 10 years on, than it was. After Katrina and Sandy, both the Department of Homeland Security, which I've worked with closely, and then the Department of Defense, which I've spent many years working with, did a lot to streamline the process for requesting military assistance, and did a lot to streamline our ability to provide military assistance in a way that's been very, very helpful. We also, the Congress passed major legislation in the wake of Hurricane Katrina to try to strengthen the Federal Emergency Management Agency as an organization. That very much bore fruit. Craig Fugate, who came out of the state of Florida, was the head of FEMA during the 8 years of the Obama administration. And he did tremendous things to strengthen FEMA, make it more effective. And I think that Brock Long, the new FEMA administrator who comes out of, I think, Alabama or Mississippi as the emergency manager, has inherited a much better set of capabilities than he would have had we not had Craig Fugate in place. Another place where I think we've learned a tremendous amount and gotten much better is we've put much more time into exercising and training our whole emergency domestic response enterprise. And that has meant that our active duty military, our Coast Guard, our National Guard, our first responders at the local level are much better able to work together, whether it's in terms of sort of response processes and things like the National Response Plan, or whether it's more technical things like having radio communications that are actually interoperable, which we haven't always had. But as I step back and, despite all of the sort of tremendous stories that you see in the news and the headlines about what's happened in the wake of the hurricanes, I do find myself asking, is that really resilience? I mean, the newspapers' articles were filled with resilience this, resilience that. And it's not obvious to me, frankly, that the decision to not evacuate Houston, for example, or all of the terrific rescue stories is really about resilience. As I came into this new center at the Atlantic Council, which is a think tank in Washington, D.C., to start this new Resilience Center, I tried to spend some time thinking about how we should and whether we can define resilience. And again, this was something I think that came up in the previous panel, the issue of how do we define resilience. And I've tried to spend some time talking with people in the academic community, talking with people in the business community about what it means. And the conclusion I've come to is that there really isn't a singular definition of resilience. It means different things to different people. It's a little bit of a Rorschach test, frankly. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I was struck that actually the Overseas Development Institute right here in London noted that there was a 9-fold increase in the term resilience in published articles from 1997 to 2015 using this thing called the Web of Science, a platform that kind of aggregates output from over 7,000 academic and research institutions. And when you looked at both academic journal literature and then also sort of gray literature that's not published in peer-reviewed journals, there were really kind of 9 major themes that came across looking at the term resilience. There was food security and agriculture, conflict, fragile states and security, urbanization and urban infrastructure, operational approaches to building resilience, measuring and framing resilience, governance, institutions, and policy planning, something that's near and dear to my heart, gender inclusion and social protection, finance, economics, and business, and then, of course, ecosystem services and natural resource management, which is really where a lot of sort of resilience work originated. And I think that struck me because it really illustrates very graphically the breadth that resilience covers and the many disciplines that it can encompass. And I think that's a strength, but it may also be a vulnerability for many of us working on resilience. I think certainly as a practitioner and as sort of a government policy maker, my community tends to be a little bit uncomfortable with such a very broad swath of disciplines. And I think all of us in the community have a vested interest in wanting to make sure that resilience doesn't become just kind of a buzzword that's devoid of meaning. And on the one hand, I think it's very heartening to see resilience becoming much more a term that's coming into the mainstream in terms of thinking of public policy issues. And it's important and I think heartening to see all of the real resources that are starting to go into bringing resilience thinking into the field in very tangible ways. But at the same time, I'm struck with how many people, when I say, oh, I'm the new director of this center at the Atlantic Council doing resilience, they kind of get a glazed look and say, what the heck is that? And I find myself thinking a little bit about a phenomenon that I saw happening in the Defense Department in the 1990s. At that point, DoD and the military services were we were very sort of taken with something called the revolution in military affairs. And it was really when information technology and networking was very much coming to the fore. And there was a lot of speculation about, what was going to be the great new technological leap ahead that was going to, make sure that we had the kinds of military capabilities to stay on top. And then Revolution in Military Affairs, RMA, kind of segued or evolved into this term transformation. And suddenly everywhere you looked in DoD, whether it was in our strategic planning documents or in our budget discussions, it was, transformation, transformation, transformation. And before you knew it, you'd be sitting in sort of the major, budget discussion meetings, and a service chief would come up and say, I want to buy the F-13 and it's transformational. And the Navy would say, I want to buy the new DDDX, and the reason why is because it's transformational. And it started to feel like this was sort of something that people, it was a label you slapped on it, and once you got that label on it, it meant you were automatically in and you were automatically going to win the budget wars. But really, when you peeled back the label, it wasn't clear what was really there, and it sometimes felt a bit like the emperor has no clothes. So I don't want the resilience community, which is a very large Big Tent community, to get to that place. I think we need to be careful about trying to preserve our multidisciplinary approach, but also having enough definition that we don't become just a buzzword. And I definitely have struggled in the last few months with the challenge of how do you reconcile defining a word that for some people is about the sustainability of natural ecosystems, but is also being used in the halls of NATO to talk about hybrid threats. I mean, that's just an enormous spectrum of issues to grapple with. And so I've really, I believe that resilience can be a very useful concept, in part significantly, and I think, again, the previous panel talked about this, because I think it puts an emphasis on longer-term thinking and longer-term solutions, and I think that's something that's very needed. But I really encourage all of us to try to find ways to make resilience tangible and sufficiently well-defined that we can explain what we're trying to do to outside audiences. So I wanted to talk a little bit about how can we make resilience meaningful? And I think one of the key strengths in my mind of the concept of resilience is the fact that it points to developing lasting solutions to a range of sources of stress, not just acute stress. I mean, I agree. I think one of the panelists a minute ago talked about how black swan events can sort of be closely associated with resilience. But I think that resilience is equally applicable and maybe even more useful in some ways for helping us grapple with more chronic sources of stress. And in some cases, I think steps that we might take to try to address chronic sources of stress can then also, be sort of dual use and help us in dealing with some more acute challenges. So for me, resilience is sort of, I think of it as almost like a cycle or a feedback loop, where it's as a concept trying to get us to think about preparedness and planning, managing through an actual acute crisis, learning the lessons coming out of that, and then trying to look at the longer term recovery so that you sort of emerge from that cycle at a higher point, so that when the next wave of disruption comes, you're hopefully in a little bit better position to be able to deal with it the next time around. And I think certainly in the United States, we have a tendency to lose track of that long-term approach, and we tend to sort of just do the short-term response and stop there, whether it's because we don't have the resources to deal with the longer-term solutions, or we don't have the political will to deal with the long-term solutions, or some combination of both. But I think if you look at the recent extreme hurricanes as an example, rather than just rebuilding, and I'm not an engineer, but this goes to a comment that you made, sir, I think what we need to be doing is looking at how do we rebuild using standards that bake in the likelihood of severe weather in the future. I think, we do need to stop or shift our thinking away from sort of what does the past 100 years of weather events tell us, but what can we try to project, with what we understand about climate change? And because I'm in the UK, I'm allowed to say climate change. If I'm in DC, I have to sort of say something else like severe weather or environmental sustainability, but I'm free, I'm unleashed. So I can say there are still many people in the United States who understand that climate change is worsening these kinds of events. But I think, we need to think about how do we bake those kinds of events and new realities into our design standards so that we're rebuilding our infrastructure not just to the level that it used to be, but to a higher level that takes those kinds of future events into account. We need to be thinking about how can we use zoning and regulation to help us develop more resilient approaches to urban planning, in areas that are prone to flood, to hurricanes, to tornadoes, et cetera. And again, there are going to be economic trade-offs here, as you all know very well. I mean, Houston is basically an unregulated city in terms of zoning. And, presumably for economic reasons, there's been incredible development in sort of the floodplain prairie areas, and land that would have been, 10 years ago there to soak up the water that came with Harvey has been paved over. And I think that's the kind of thing that I think city managers are going to have to step back and make much more explicit choices about, do we want to pursue the economic benefits, and this goes to a point that Jennifer Cole made, or is there perhaps a greater societal good in maybe foregoing some of that economic opportunity to try to make sure that a city is safer and more resilient over the long term? I think another important key to making resilience relevant is emphasizing why resilience thinking is so important. And something I was very much struck with in the last 8 years of my government experience is that I think the resilience community understands that we simply no longer can prevent every kind of threat, and we can't reduce all risks to zero. We can't anticipate all of the cascading effects that are going to come from the incredible interdependencies that we now have in our societies. So the solution is, I think, much more trying to build in resilience as much as we can, recognizing that we're not going to be able to stop all of the different sources of disruption that are coming. And in that view, I think because resilience has so many different meanings in different contexts, articulating what we think as a community are the primary qualities that make systems, make organizations and communities resilient can be very helpful. I think putting forward conceptual frameworks and ways to think about resilience that are pretty explicit can make the work in our field more tangible and accessible. In that vein, I think I found what the Rockefeller Foundation, through its 100 Resilient Cities initiative, and what the Stockholm Resilience Center have done to articulate qualities or principles of resilience has been very helpful. Both of these organizations have tried to emphasize the importance of learning, of redundancy, of inclusiveness or participation, of integration and connectivity as the kinds of traits or characteristics that you tend to see in systems that are more resilient as opposed to those that are perhaps more brittle or static. And I have really been impressed by the work that Rockefeller has done in trying to use these qualities to shape the approaches that they're taking to thinking about resilience in an urban context and trying to develop ways to measure resiliency in cities. I think another example of a framework that, again, from sort of a government practitioner standpoint that's helped in terms of making resilience tangible has been the Disaster Resilience Scorecard that the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction has put forward. I think, many of the challenges that cities are trying to address, whether, again, it's chronic stresses like poverty or the effects of pollution, for example, or whether it's dealing with natural disasters, you're going to have qualitative elements of that are going to be inherently difficult to measure precisely. But some of the frameworks that I think that have been put forward can help us and can help city managers and resilience officers try to guide their thinking and make decisions about where to invest and where to make trade-offs. So at this new center that I'm starting, and we really are very new, we're trying to, we want to build on that kind of, I think, strong practical work. And we're going to pick a couple of major public policy problems every year and try to focus on how can we help a range of actors, whether, again, it's cities or the business community or national governments, how can we help those actors build greater resilience capacity to address the challenges? So, for example, I think, we will perhaps this year be looking at global health threats, like how do we prepare for a future pandemic? I think 2018 is the 100th year of the Spanish flu, and as we saw just with the Ebola outbreak in 2014 and 2015, unfortunately, I think a pandemic is a real challenge ahead of us, not a black swan, but something we need to think about. I think another major source of disruption that I'd like to see our new center start grappling with is the rise of artificial intelligence and the implications it's going to have for our societies around the world in terms of how are we going to help workers and the workforce adjust to that? How do we, what kinds of scenarios, frankly, can we anticipate with the rise of artificial intelligence? And like RUSI here in London, the Atlantic Council is well known for its convening power, and we really want to use that strength of ours to put a spotlight on all of the different kinds of work that's being done around resilience, whether it's looking at urban resilience or whether it's looking at challenges like cyber attacks on critical infrastructure or other places where resilience and national security intersect, such as dealing with terrorism or hybrid threats. And we really want to bring forward, and again, Atlantic Council is, I would say we're in between the space of government and practitioners and true academia. I would really like to see us spotlight a lot of the high quality work that's being done in academia and help be a little bit of a bridge between all of the terrific research that's done in university settings and governments who, frankly, and I can speak from experience, don't have a lot of time or even expertise to sort of make it through some of the stuff that's being put forward in peer-reviewed journals. There is, I think, tremendous value there, and I would love to find a way to bring forward some of the best work and make it more accessible to officials who often are reading, 3 pages at the most, or getting sort of a 15-minute brief before they run into a meeting where they can make some pretty consequential decisions. So I thought I would just close, I think, with a few thoughts on why the concept of resilience, I think, really is important and relevant given the state of the world that we're in. I spent about 7 years in the Defense Department as a civil servant in the late 1990s, and I was there in 2001 when the Pentagon was hit. And then more recently, I spent almost the full 8 years in the Obama administration, both in DOD and then also at the White House, as Karen mentioned. And I'm convinced from both of those experiences that approaching the kinds of challenges that we face today through the lens of resilience is really important for 2 major reasons. The first is that the scope and the scale of disruptions that we're facing is simply enormous. And frankly, I don't think we're going to significantly improve our ability to predict what's coming. I think, one of the folks who asked a question of the last panel sort of said, we never get the risks right. And I agree with that. In the early years of the Obama administration, I went to the Situation Room to deal with responding to the Haiti earthquake, the Deepwater Horizon oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, and we also were struggling with how to prepare for what we thought was going to be a major H1N1 outbreak. We sort of dodged a bullet on that, but the process of even just trying to plan for that in terms of continuity of operation was eye-opening in terms of, frankly, how ill-prepared we were. When I worked at the National Security Council, we spent hours working with the Japanese and others to respond to the tsunami and the Fukushima nuclear disaster. And then in between meetings on those kinds of crises, we were grappling with a much greater understanding. First of all, we were trying to sort of develop what is our sort of public policy framework for thinking about the cyber domain. At the same time, we were coming to understand much more the tremendous vulnerabilities that we had in the cyber domain. And while I think we've made progress there, there's a tremendous amount of work that continues to need to be done. When I went back to the Pentagon in 2012, we were hit with Hurricane Sandy, where we were again working with state and local officials to deal with that. And then 2013, we found ourselves facing another terrorist attack with the Boston Marathon bombing. So it just didn't stop. And then when I became Undersecretary of Defense from 2014 to 2016, we were confronted with everything from the rise of ISIS in the Middle East to little green men in Ukraine to the Ebola outbreak in Western Africa, just to name a few. And we frankly just didn't anticipate many of these challenges. When I was running the Quadrennial Defense Review in 2014, I literally remember the night before we sent the report to the printer, we were looking at what Russia was doing in Crimea and Ukraine, and we were having to sort of go back into our text and revise because we had failed to sort of see all of that coming. And, change is just going to continue to come at us, whether it is climate change, societal change, or technological change. So focusing, I think, on resilience as opposed to trying to prevent all of these challenges and trying to find resilient approaches to these public policy problems, I think will help us manage the change even if we can't stop it. It's tolerating, frankly, some of the risks and recognizing that we can't mitigate all of them fully. The second reason I think I'm firmly convinced of the importance of resilience, and again, this goes to my time in government, is that national governments alone, no matter how competent or how well-resourced, and I certainly think of the British government and the United States government as two of the most competent governments around, notwithstanding some bumps around the edges, we can't do everything on our own. And the press of current events, the crush of crisis management, the growing partisan cleavages, frankly, we see in our democracies, are making it harder for governments to try to grapple with all of this on their own. And I think you see, frankly, cities and in some cases the private sector coming in to fill a little bit of the gap, which I think is healthy in many ways, and I think we should welcome that. So I think this is a place where we can really work together to engage other actors below the national government level, cities, city mayors, city managers, the business community, civil society groups, universities, and really try to build partnerships to grow resilient capacity and to develop resilient solutions to problems. So I'm really heartened by the amount of energy I see in the academic community on concepts of resilience. I'm excited about how much those ideas have been taken up by organizations like the Rockefeller Foundation or like the work that Bloomberg has done, where they're putting real money against these kinds of ideas. And I hope we'll see that continue. And I hope that the Adrienne Arsht Center at the Atlantic Council, which is just a tiny organization right now, will be able to contribute meaningfully to that. And I hope we'll be able to partner with many of the organizations that you all represent, because to borrow a word from Hillary Clinton, I think we're stronger together. So thank you.
All right, thank you very much.